The tray hit the floor before the laughter did. I felt the cold soak through my sock before I understood what had happened. Someone's elbow, someone's foot, 30 ounces of cafeteria lemonade spreading across the tile in a shape like a country I would never visit. Then the sound came. That specific brand of laughter that only exists in rooms full of people who have never once had to eat lunch alone and count the minutes until it was safe to stand up. Watch it, scholarship. Priscilla Thorne didn't look at me when she said it. She said it the way you'd flick lint off a sleeve. I did what I always did. I said nothing. I picked up my tray. My hands didn't shake, not the way they used to freshman year, but my mouth still forgot how to make consonants when a room turned to look at me. So I let the silence do the talking and carried my empty tray to the return window like the puddle on the floor belonged to somebody else. 2 years at Wren Hollow University, and I had made exactly one friend, kept exactly one job, and worn exactly one face in public, the one that didn't invite questions. My name is Marlo Hale. I was 19, on a full need-based scholarship that covered tuition and housing and not 1 cent more, and I had a habit my aunt used to call my superpower. Before she died and took the only person who called it that with her, I could look at a column of numbers for 4 seconds and know which one was lying. Nobody at Wren Hollow knew that about me. Nobody at Wren Hollow knew much about me at all, and that was exactly how I had arranged it, because the last time people found out what I could do with a ledger, it cost my family the only business they had left, and me every friend I'd ever made in that town. So I kept my head down. I worked the archive desk in the Vane Special Collections wing 4 nights a week, and I ate lunch alone at Carol 12 when the cafeteria got too loud, which was most days. Subscribe to the channel before we go any further, because where this story is about to go, you will not want to miss a second of it. That particular Tuesday, Carol 12 was already occupied by someone else's silence. She sat 2 tables from the window. At the end of the room, everyone avoided because the heater vent above it rattled, with a cup of black coffee going cold and a paperback she wasn't reading. I had seen her before, a tall, dark-haired girl in plain clothes that cost more than they looked like they cost, always alone, always early, always gone before the room filled. People called her Gus. Nobody seemed to know her last name, and nobody seemed to want to find out, the way you don't poke a bruise you can't explain. I noticed her the way I noticed everything, from a distance, cataloging rather than approaching. She never flinched when Priscilla's table erupted into laughter. She never looked around to see who was watching her. She ate like a woman completing a task, and when she thought no one could see her, her jaw tightened like she was holding something back with her back teeth. I don't know why that Tuesday was different. Maybe it was the lemonade drying sticky on my ankle. Maybe it was turning 19 3 weeks earlier with nobody to call. I only know that I crossed the room before I gave myself time to talk myself out of it and stopped at the edge of her table, and my voice came out smaller than I meant it to. "Can I sit with you?" She looked up. Her eyes were the color of a storm that hasn't decided yet whether to break, and for 1 full second she said nothing, and I felt every cell in my body preparing to apologize and leave. Then she pulled out the chair across from her with her foot. "It's free," she said. "The seat's usually free." I sat. Up close she smelled like vetiver and rain on slate, cold and clean and faintly dangerous, like a window left open in a storm, and something in me, some old, buried animal part of me, noted it the way you note a name you'll need later. I didn't know yet that it was the first thing I would learn to recognize blind, in a crowded room from 50 feet away. I only knew that for the first time in 2 years, someone had made space for me without being asked twice. "Marlo," I said before she could ask, because if I waited for the question, I might lose my nerve. Gus. She studied me for a second, too long. You're the one who works the archive nights. How do you know that? I've seen you locking up. She said it like a fact, not a confession, and went back to her coffee. And I sat there in the rattling heat of that corner table, with my heart going too fast for a conversation about library hours, thinking that whoever this girl was, she noticed things. She noticed the way I noticed things. I had no idea yet how much that would come to matter, or how much I still didn't know about who exactly had just made room for me at her table. The financial aid office called me in on a Thursday, which should have told me something was wrong before I even sat down, because Thursdays were for parking tickets and lost ID cards, not for a stack of printed spreadsheets waiting on the desk like a trap. "We need your eyes on something," said Miss Petrova, the harried woman who ran work-study assignments, sliding the stack toward me. "You're good with numbers. Everyone says so. Nobody was supposed to say so." I kept my face still and pulled the papers closer anyway, because saying no to my only source of extra income wasn't a luxury I had. It took me 4 minutes to find it, a line item in the General Scholarship Disbursement Fund, $72,000 routed through a vendor account that didn't exist anywhere else in the ledger, dated the same week every semester for 3 years running. My pulse did something complicated. I had seen this shape before, in a different town, in a different set of books, and it had ended with my family's name dragged through every kitchen in the county. "There's a discrepancy," I said carefully. "It's probably nothing. A coding error." It was not nothing, and some traitor part of my brain was already building the spreadsheet that would prove it, even as my mouth was busy telling Miss Petrova the opposite. I photographed the page with my phone before I handed the folder back, and I told myself it was just in case, the way you tell yourself a lot of things right before your life changes shape. I didn't know then that the vendor account traced back to Dean Ashford's brother-in-law. I didn't know that the girl with the storm-colored eyes who'd made room for me at her table was, in 3 weeks' time, going to be the reason that Ledger stopped being able to hide. I only knew, walking back across the quad with the late sun turning the library's copper roof to fire, that some part of me that had been quiet for 2 years had just woken up, and it smelled, absurdly, like vetiver and rain. The chance to prove what I could do came faster than I expected, and it came in front of the entire junior class. Wrenhollow held its annual Founders' Assembly in the Hollingsworth Auditorium every October, an evening of speeches and a scholarship budget presentation that nobody attended for entertainment. I was there because Miss Petrova had volunteered me to run the projector, which was how I ended up backstage when the finance office's presentation software crashed 40 minutes before 600 people were due to file in, taking 3 years of budget slides with it. "We have a printed copy," the treasurer said, sweating through his collar, "but it's the old numbers. It doesn't reconcile with what the board's expecting. And if Celine Vane sits in that front row and asks one question about it, I can rebuild it," I said, before I decided to say it. Every head backstage turned. I felt my face go hot, but I kept talking, because the alternative was watching a room full of powerful people catch a room full of amateurs unprepared, and something in me, my aunt's voice, maybe, telling me that hiding a gift doesn't make you safer, just smaller, wouldn't let me stay quiet this time. Give me the raw export and 20 minutes. It took me 16. I rebuilt 3 years of disbursement slides from a corrupted spreadsheet on a laptop balanced on a folding chair, and in the process, my eyes snagged on that same vendor line, larger now. Dressed up in new column headers so it wouldn't stand out to anyone who wasn't already looking for it. I didn't say anything about it out loud. I just made sure the slide displaying it stayed on screen 4 seconds longer than it needed to, long enough for anyone paying real attention to notice the shape of it. Someone was paying real attention. I found out because when the assembly ended and the treasurer was shaking my hand like I'd saved his job, which I had, a voice behind me said, low and even, "You saw it too." I turned. Gus stood in the wings in a dark green dress that made her look like she belonged to the building instead of visiting it, and up close her scent had changed, sharper, colder, the way a room changes when a storm is about to break for real instead of just threatening to. She wasn't talking about the slides that worked, she was talking about the one line that shouldn't have. "Saw what?" I said, because 2 years of practice had taught me to lie first and trust later. "The vendor account." Her eyes didn't move off mine. 70-something thousand, same week every year, no matching invoice in the public ledger. You highlighted it for exactly 4 seconds. That wasn't an accident. My whole body went cold and then, absurdly, warm, because nobody had ever looked at my work and seen me inside it before. "Who are you?" I said. "Really?" She hesitated, just long enough for me to notice it, the way I noticed everything. "Someone who wants to know if you're safe, asking questions like that in this building." She reached into her bag and pressed a card into my hand. Plain cream stock, no name, just an address and a time. "There's a work-study opening in the Vane Special Collections wing. Better hours, better pay. I can get you an interview tomorrow if you want it." I looked down at the card, at the crest embossed faintly into the corner of it, a stylized V wrapped in ivy, and something in the back of my mind that had been assembling facts all semester. The deference of the staff, the way certain doors opened without anyone swiping a card, the portrait in the main hall of a silver-haired woman everyone called the campus queen without ever saying why, clicked one notch closer to a shape I wasn't ready to see yet. "Why would you do that for me?" I asked. "Because somebody should," Gus said, and turned to go before I could ask what that meant, leaving me standing in the wings with a stranger's card in my hand and her scent still caught in the folds of the curtain, cold and clean, like a door that had just opened onto weather I didn't understand yet. The Vane Special Collections wing did not look like a place a scholarship kid was supposed to work. The reading room alone was bigger than the entire library back home, its ceiling ribbed in dark oak, its windows tall enough to fit a person lying down, and every surface polished to a hush that made my sneakers sound like an apology. I filled out the intake paperwork at a desk that had probably cost more than my aunt's car, and I tried not to flinch when the head archivist, a warm, sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Okafor, told me my hours would triple my old pay and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I knew whose name was on the wing. "Vane," I said, like the crest. "Celine Vane, Mrs." Okafor said, straightening a stack of accession slips with the fondness of someone who has worked for a family a long time. "Chair of the board. People around here call her the campus queen, though never to her face, God help them." She said it lightly, but something in her tone told me the nickname wasn't affectionate so much as accurate. This whole wing is hers. Half the scholarships in this university are hers too, one way or another. I filed that away the way I filed everything, quietly, and didn't think much of it again until the first time I visited Gus's apartment. It was 3 blocks off campus, in a building with no doorman and a buzzer that stuck, and I remember being relieved by how ordinary it looked, how the couch had a blanket thrown over a worn spot and the bookshelf sagged slightly in the middle. It felt like a place a person lived, not a place a fortune slept. Gus made soup that night, standing at the stove with her sleeves pushed up, and when I asked why, in a kitchen that small, with a scent like storm-washed stone still clinging to her hair from the shower, she'd bothered to remember that I liked mine with too much pepper. She just shrugged like it wasn't a question worth asking. "You mentioned it once," she said. 3 weeks ago, I mention a lot of things. I remember the ones that matter. I didn't have an answer for that, so I ate my soup and let the warmth of the kitchen paper over the small, persistent itch at the back of my mind. The crest on the card, the deference of the staff, the way the security guard at the wing's side door had called her Miss Vane once, quickly, before catching himself and correcting to Gus with a look I hadn't understood at the time. It was Priscilla Thorne who finally said it out loud, 3 days later, cornering me outside the dining hall with 2 of her friends flanking her like a matched set of knives. "I have to admit," she said, tilting her head, "I didn't think even you were desperate enough to chase her for the money." "I'm not chasing anyone," I said, which came out steadier than I felt. "Sure," Priscilla smiled, the kind of smile that has never once meant anything kind. "Does she know yet? That you didn't know?" She let the silence stretch, enjoying it. Or is that part of the fun for you, pretending you don't know exactly whose daughter you've been having sleepovers with? I stood very still in the cold, the word daughter landing somewhere behind my sternum like a dropped stone, and for the first time since October, I let myself actually look, really look, at the shape I'd been refusing to see. The crest, the deference. The campus queen's own eyes, storm gray, looking back at me every single time Gus glanced up from a book. My phone buzzed in my pocket before I could finish the thought. A text from an unknown number, formal in a way that made my stomach drop before I'd even opened it. "Miss Hale, Celine Vane would like to see you in her office at 4 o'clock today. It is not optional." I sat across the desk from her at 4 o'clock exactly, in an office with a window the size of a wall and a view of the whole campus spread out gold and ordinary below it, and I understood within 30 seconds why every student who ever crossed this woman referred to her, in careful whispers, as the campus queen. She didn't stand when I entered. She didn't need to. Celine Vane had the kind of stillness that made a room organize itself around her, without her lifting a finger. Silver hair swept back from a face that shared, unmistakably, its daughter's storm-colored eyes, and none of her daughter's softness. "Miss Hale," she said, "you found something in my university's ledgers that no auditor in 3 years managed to find." "I didn't mean to," I said, and hated how small it sounded. "That is precisely why I believe you." She folded her hands on the desk. "I am going to ask you a question, and I would like the truth, not the answer you think keeps you safest. Do you know who my daughter is?" The room seemed to tilt very slightly. "Augusta," I said, the syllables strange in my mouth, a name I'd never once heard Gus use. "Vane, Augusta Calloway Vane," Celine corrected, and for just a moment something moved behind those flat storm eyes, something that might have been grief. "She uses her father's surname here. She has, since he died, wanted exactly one thing that had nothing to do with mine." She studied me for a long, unreadable beat. "You are the first person in 4 years she has brought near it." I didn't know what to do with that, sitting in a chair that cost more than a semester's books, my whole understanding of the last month rearranging itself around a name I hadn't known I was falling for. Before I could find words, the door opened without a knock, and Dean Ashford stepped in, a folder under his arm and an expression I would come to recognize, far too late, as the face of a man closing a trap. "Celine," he said too smoothly. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but this concerns Miss Hale directly, and I thought it best not to wait." He set the folder on the desk, and opened it to a page with my work-study login stamped across the top, beside a column of numbers I had never touched in my life. We've traced an unauthorized transfer from the scholarship fund to a personal account. It appears to originate from Miss Hale's credentials. The room went very quiet, the kind of quiet that comes right before something breaks. "That's not possible," I said, my voice cracking on the second word, because I already knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, exactly whose fingerprints were really on that ledger, and exactly how far someone was willing to go to make sure the girl who'd found the truth never got the chance to say it out loud. They suspended me pending investigation the next morning, and I found out I could still feel humiliation in new and specific ways, because this one came with campus security walking me out of the vain wing in front of Mrs. Okafor, who looked at me like her heart was breaking, and in front of the reading room's tall windows, which meant half the students at their carols turned to watch. I didn't see Gus for 4 days. I told myself it was because she was busy, because her mother had summoned her too, because there was a version of this where the girl who smelled like storm-washed stone hadn't simply decided that a scandal wasn't worth the inconvenience of me. I didn't believe it, not really, but grief has its own logic, and mine had spent 2 years learning that people leave quietly, without explanations. The way my aunt left, the way my old town left, the way everything eventually left. On the 4th night, I collapsed in the campus quad. I hadn't eaten properly in 2 days, my meal plan had been frozen along with everything else, and I hadn't slept either, running the forged numbers over and over behind my eyes, trying to find the seam where the fraud had actually been built. And somewhere between the library steps and my dorm, the world simply tipped sideways and went dark. I woke up on a couch that smelled like vetiver and rain, a blanket pulled to my chin, and Gus, sitting on the floor beside me, with her back against the cushions, dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept either. "You fainted," she said, before I could ask. "In the quad, Reyes found you. He works for my family, don't ask. It's a long story I should have told you weeks ago." Her jaw tightened. "I've been in board meetings for 4 days trying to keep my mother from expelling Ashford on the spot without proof, because proof is the only thing that will actually stick, and I should have called you, I should have. You could have called," I said. And it came out sharper than I meant, all 4 days of silence breaking loose at once. "I thought you disappeared. I thought I was something you were embarrassed by once your mother found out." Embarrassed, Gus said the word like it tasted wrong. "Marlo, I have spent 4 years making sure nobody at this school knew whose daughter I was, so that when someone finally looked at me, they were looking at me. You are the only person who ever has." She reached over, slow enough that I could have pulled away, and stopped an inch from my hand. "Tell me if this is too much, and I'll stop." "Don't stop," I said. Her fingers closed around mine, warm despite the cold apartment, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all, just sat there in the dark with the whole wrecked week between us, her scent settling over the blanket like something that had finally found a place to land. "My father died in that office," she said quietly, into the silence. "Heart attack, at his desk, at 41, because my mother's family runs on a doctrine that says an alpha who needs anyone is an alpha who can be used against you. He believed it his whole life." I watched what it cost him. Her thumb moved once across my knuckles, absent, unconscious. I don't want to be the kind of strong that ends like that. I turned my hand over until our palms met, and something in my chest that had been braced for 4 days finally let go. "I don't think you are," I said. "I think you're the first strong thing that's ever made room for me, instead of taking up all the space." She looked at me then, really looked, the way she had that first day at Carol 12, and I understood, with the same clean certainty I felt reading a column of numbers, that whatever came next, the hearing, the fraud charge, her mother's war with the dean, I wasn't facing it alone anymore. We spent the next 2 weeks the way you spend a war you can't yet see the end of, building a case in the daylight and building each other back up in the dark. Gus's apartment became the war room. I laid the scholarship ledgers across her coffee table night after night, tracing the vendor account back through 3 years of disguised transfers. While she made soup she'd learned I liked too peppery, and sat across from me untangling board bylaws with the same focus she brought to everything. It was in the 3rd week that she found the paperback in my bag, my aunt's old copy of a novel called The Long Harbor, its spine cracked white, a pressed clover marking page 112, and asked, carefully, whose it was. My Aunt Ruth's, I said. She raised me. She died my senior year of high school, right after the diner where she worked got audited over discrepancies I found and couldn't keep quiet about. People blamed me for it going public. I lost every friend I had before I ever set foot on this campus. I ran my thumb over the broken spine. This is the only thing of hers I kept. Gus didn't say anything comforting, which I was grateful for, because comfort would have felt like a lie. She just took the book gently from my hands, examined the split binding with the same careful attention she gave everything, and said, I can fix this. Give me a week. That was the night the restraint finally broke, slow and deliberate, the way everything with her had been. She asked me with her words first, the way she asked everything, her forehead resting against mine, her hands still. Tell me to stop, and I will. Don't stop, I said again, and this time it wasn't fear making my voice shake. Her claim, when it came weeks later, would be a bond and a bite and a promise spoken out loud in front of witnesses. That night was smaller than that, and no less enormous, her mouth finding mine slow and certain. Her restraint the loudest thing in the room, proof that a woman raised on a doctrine of control could choose, deliberately, gently, to hold nothing back except her strength. The phone rang at 11 the next morning, while I still had her sweater sleeves rolled to my wrists and her scent in my hair. It was Mrs. Okafor, her voice tight with something like fear. Marlowe, you need to come to the administration building. Now, Priscilla Thorne has filed formal charges. They've scheduled an expulsion hearing for Friday. And Marlowe, they have evidence. New evidence. It doesn't look good. I looked at Gus, who was already reaching for her coat, her jaw set in the same hard line her mother's had been the day I first sat across from her, and I felt the warmth of the last 2 weeks curdle into something colder and far more familiar. The sense, worn smooth by years of practice, that the world was about to take something good away from me before I'd even had the chance to keep it. The hearing evidence was worse than I'd imagined, because it was built entirely out of things that were almost true. Priscilla stood before the disciplinary board in a blazer the color of money and presented a printout of my login history, time-stamped, official-looking, showing 3 transfers I had never made, routed to an account I had never opened. Dean Ashford sat beside her, nodding gravely, playing the part of a reluctant institution forced to do its duty. Celine Vane sat in the front row, her face a wall of careful neutrality, and I understood, watching her, that she was choosing her family's public position with the same cold precision she brought to a boardroom, protecting the university's name first and asking questions after, because that was the doctrine she'd been raised on too. Miss Vane, the board chair, asked her directly, "Does the family have any comment on its association with the accused?" "None," Celine said, and the word landed in the room like a door closing. I felt it in my chest before I understood it in my head, that she had just, publicly, chosen distance. I looked for Gus in the gallery and didn't find her. She'd been called out 20 minutes earlier by an aide and hadn't come back. The board voted to suspend my scholarship pending a formal fraud review, effective immediately, and gave me until Monday to vacate my dorm. I packed in under an hour. There wasn't much to pack. I left the mended paperback for last, wrapped it in a sweater at the bottom of my duffel the way you'd wrap something breakable, and walked to the bus stop in a hard, cold rain with my phone dead in my pocket and every certainty I'd built over the last 2 months collapsing behind me like a building with its foundation removed. I sat on the bench under the flickering shelter light and did not cry, because crying had never once fixed a column of numbers, and somewhere in the back of my mind I heard my aunt's voice telling me that hiding had never made me safe, and I thought, with a bitterness that surprised me, that maybe this time it would have. Celine Vane found me an hour before the last bus. She arrived without an entourage, in a plain black coat, and sat down on the wet bench beside me like a woman used to discomfort, which surprised me more than anything else that terrible day. "I did not distance myself from you," she said, without preamble. "I distanced this institution from a false accusation, publicly, so that when I dismantled it, no one could claim I'd protected my daughters." She paused, choosing the word carefully. Attachment. "I have spent 4 days building a forensic audit of Corwin Ashford's accounts with a team he does not know exists." "And?" I said, hardly daring to breathe. "And you were right the first time you looked at that ledger, months ago, when you were too frightened to say so out loud." She held out a slim folder. "The vendor account traces to Ashford's brother-in-law. Priscilla altered your login timestamps using system access her uncle gave her. I have the original server logs, unaltered, timestamped before her edits. What I do not have," she said, and here, for the first time, her composure cracked just slightly, "is my daughter's forgiveness for letting her believe, even for an hour, that I would let this stand." Gus stepped out from behind the shelter's far pillar then, soaked through, having clearly been standing there the whole time working up the nerve to be seen, and the two women looked at each other for a long moment that held 16 years of complicated history in it. Then Gus crossed to me instead, cupped my rain-cold face in both hands, and said the thing I would carry for the rest of my life. "I am not sorry for who my mother is," she said. "I am sorry it took her this long to be the kind of alpha I always needed her to be. Come home. Both our homes, if you'll let them be that." The emergency board hearing was called for 8 the next morning, and by 9, the campus queen had ended a decade of borrowed authority with a single folder. Celine didn't raise her voice once. She laid the forensic audit on the table, page by page, the true server logs beside Priscilla's altered ones, the vendor payments beside Ashford's brother-in-law's bank statements. 3 years of theft rebuilt in exacting, undeniable order, and let the numbers do what numbers had always done best in my hands, tell the truth, whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. Dean Ashford resigned before security reached his office. Priscilla Thorne was expelled by unanimous vote before lunch, her family's endowed chair quietly withdrawn within the week, the legacy that had made her untouchable dissolving the instant it was actually tested. I sat in the front row this time, not the gallery, my scholarship reinstated with a formal apology read into the record, and when the board chair asked if anyone wished to speak, Reyes, who I would learn had driven Gus to school every day of her freshman year and never once told a soul who she was, stood from the back row and said, in a voice rough with something like pride, "In 11 years working for this family, I have never once seen Augusta wait outside a building for anyone." She waited 4 hours outside that hearing room. I thought the board should know what that means, even if it isn't on the record. It went on the record anyway. Gus found me on the library steps that evening, in the last gold light before the street lamps came on, and knelt down in front of the whole quad without an ounce of her old caution. "I don't have a box or a speech," she said, "because I've had exactly one true thing to say since October, and it hasn't changed. You saw something broken and told the truth about it even when it cost you everything. Twice, in 2 different lives. I want to be the 3rd life where telling the truth doesn't cost you anything at all." She held both my hands, steady despite the tremor I could feel under her calm. "Marlo Hale, will you let me claim you? Bond, mark, all of it, but only the parts you want, only when you want them." "Ask me properly," I said, laughing through something that was mostly tears. "Marry me. Bond with me. Let me be the home you stopped believing you were allowed to have." "Yes," I said, and when her teeth found the curve of my throat that night, gentle and asked for and certain, the whole apartment filled with the warmed, tangled scent of fig and honey and rain-struck stone, 2 signatures becoming, unmistakably, one. A year later, the Vane Special Collections wing added a new shelf to its rare book room, a small locked case near the reading room window where the light falls best in the afternoon, and inside it sits a paperback with a mended spine and a pressed clover still marking page 112, donated in memory of Ruth Hale, whose niece taught the whole university that the quietest people in the room are usually the ones who have been counting everything all along. We were bonded properly that spring, in the reading room itself, under the ribbed oak ceiling, with Mrs. Okafor crying into a handkerchief in the 2nd row, and Celine Vane, who insisted on being called Celine now, at least in private, reading a short, unsentimental toast that made her daughter laugh until she cried anyway. Reyes stood by the door the whole ceremony, the way he always had, and told anyone who asked that he'd known this was coming since the day Gus waited 4 hours outside a hearing room for a girl who couldn't afford to buy her own lunch. I still work the archive desk some nights, not because I need to anymore, but because Carol 12 by the window is still my favorite seat in the world, and because the girl who once asked to sit with me still finds her way there most evenings, cold coffee in hand, storm-colored eyes finding mine across the same table where this all began. The invisible ones are not invisible forever. Sometimes it only takes one seat offered, one true thing said out loud, to prove that somebody was watching all along. The end. If a story about being the quiet one who finally gets seen found its way into your chest tonight, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. I'd love to know in the comments, what's the one thing about yourself you've kept hidden the way Marlo hid her gift with numbers, waiting for the right person to finally notice? Tell me below. Until next time, keep believing the right person will pull out that chair for you too.